We almost finished our discussion of cooperation, which is summarized or modeled by the prisoner's dilemma, right? So let's just have a review of the experimental result, right? So again, this is not the result from our in-class experiment. This is from a previous year because we, again, did not have enough time to finish all the tasks. But these patterns are common patterns that I observe across all kinds of experiment, including in-class experiment or lab experiment or online experiment. So here we can see that we have a prisoner's dilemma. So here the dominant strategy is to always choose Y regardless of what the other person is choosing. So Y is called a defect in prisoner dilemma, and X is called to cooperate in this prisoner dilemma. And we learn that it is mutually beneficial for both players to cooperate, but it is a dominant strategy to always choose defect because regardless of what the other player will do, it is best for you to, not best for you, it is rational for you to defect in order to receive a higher payoff, right? And in the experiment, there are two treatments. One treatment is trying to mimic the situation that you are interacting with a stranger, right? So you play this prisoner dilemma for 10 rounds, but at the start of each round, you will be rematched with a new player that is anonymous. You don't know who they are to play the prisoner dilemma. As you can see here, right? So at the start, there's some level of cooperation. It's maybe more than 30%, but we do see cooperation rate gradually decrease, right? So this is consistent with the prediction of Nash equilibrium that everyone will defect. But if you look at the partner matching, meaning that you will interact with the same opponent, the same player for 10 rounds, the cooperation rate is significantly higher. Right? It's more than 50%, it's close to 60%. But we do see that towards the end of the interaction, cooperation rate drops to very low, right? So this is the so-called end game effect, right? So, the reason, as we discussed in the previous class, the reason why cooperation rate is higher in pattern matching is that you can refrain from defection to choose Y so that you are able to expect a higher long-term payoff, right? So you give up this immediate payoff of getting 2 additional units of payment, but in the long run, you are able to achieve this 4, right? Otherwise, if you defect in the first round, then you get stuck into this Nash equilibrium, but with lower payoff, right? So this trade-off between immediate gains versus long-term gains make people more likely to cooperate, right? But at the end, there's no future, right? So there's no relationship anymore. So then the concerns for long-term cooperation will be non-existent. It's similar to the stranger matching. So that's why we observe this end game effect, right? So sometimes I call it this end of world effect, right? So if the world is ending tomorrow, we would probably to see more chaos, right? So of course, some people are still civilian, still courteous, but we would expect a lot of people would defect on the prisoner dilemma because reputation does not matter, relationship does not matter anymore, right? So this is how this repeated interaction can help and promote cooperation, right? And then we discuss 3 mechanisms to solve the prisoner dilemma. Right? We mentioned the third-party regulation, right? So we have the legal system and the social norms that help us to maintain cooperation, and also repeated interaction. I mean, that what we have already seen from this experiment, right? So when you have repeated interaction, this direct reciprocity would help promote cooperation. Right? In some of the in-class experiment, I also include this reputation treatment, meaning that after you have interact with someone, you will be again randomly matched with a new player, but your past history, whether you cooperated or not, are shown to the future opponents matched with you. Right? So that is the reputation effect. If we are able to run the experiment, you will see that reputation can also promote and increase cooperation, although it is not as effective as repeated interaction. Right? So one thing that we mentioned related to repeated interaction and the direct reciprocity is the strategy that has been proven to be most effective in achieving a good outcome in repeated prisoner dilemma. That is tit for tat, right? So tit for tat is a good strategy because it has these three properties. It's nice, never be the first to defect. It's provocable, meaning it will return defection for defection, cooperation for cooperation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as proclaimed in the Bible, right? But at the same time, it's forgiving. Even though you are provocable, you will punish the other person's defection. But if the other person is willing to come to reestablish this cooperative relationship with you, you are forgiving. You are willing to come back to cooperation after it breaks down. Right? And the interesting thing about tit for tat is that it can never beat the opponent. It can never earn a higher payoff compared to the opponent, right? So the best thing is that you can earn the same payoff, right? So on average, you actually, if you use tit for tat to play a random strategy, on average, your payoff will be lower than the others because if you encounter a player who defect on you, I mean, you get exploited, your payoff is lower than the opponent. But the important thing to realize that the key in repeated prisoner dilemma is that you play this game multiple times, infinite times in real life, right? The key is not to beat the other to win, but to achieve a win-win situation so that in the long run and average, you are able to achieve this efficient outcome so that your average payoff throughout these interactions with other people will be higher. Right? And then we talk about one specific example, tit for tat, which is the price match, right? So it seems that price match is a policy that are proposed and established by the business, the companies to care for the consumers. But we have discussed that this is also a mechanism that are imposing or playing the tit for tat strategies against all the competitors. Right? I explained, for example, Bauhaus have this price match, right? So selling certain stuff, and if I purchase something from Bauhaus, for example, a lawnmower from Bauhaus, and then I realized that Yamofix is selling exactly model of the lawnmower at a lower price. What I'll do, of course, as a consumer, I would like to use this price match policy so that I go to Bauhaus and ask for a refund of the price difference, right? For Bauhaus, it's a small amount of money, but the information they get is quite important because now Bauhaus know that Yamofix is selling the same product as a lower price. Right? It's like I'm monitoring Yamofix pricing strategy, whether they are cutting price to steal customers, right? So because of this price match policy, Bauhaus is automatically employing this tit for tat strategy. Once other competitors are cutting price, then Bauhaus will take action. Right? And also, this is a good strategy because if Yamofix know that Bauhaus has this price match strategy, they will think twice to cut price because they know that once they cut price, Bauhaus will match this price automatically because of this price match strategy. Right? So that's how this price match is used as tit for tat strategy to maintain high price among competitors. Right? So we think tit for tat is a good strategy for business, but we also observe back in history that this tit for tat can also be used in this trench war, right? So during World War One, especially this prolonged period of trench war, that the two sides of the armies have difficulties in pressing an additional inch, right? So they get this stalemate for a long period of time. So in that case, we observe this spontaneous rise of cooperative behavior, right? So because you got stuck there, so you have this long-term, interaction, right? So it's not one shot anymore. So we see that the British and the German troops, they start to have this cooperative behavior, right? So these are actually some pictures taken on this Christmas truce between these opposing trenches, and it's even reported by this newspaper, the Daily Mirror. And so tit for tat strategy, can naturally emerge in business and also even in wars where it's life and death situation. But as long as you have this repeated interaction, right? So it's not one shot that you are interacting with the same person, the same party for a prolonged period of time, then you are able to emerge, to employ this corresponding tit for tat strategy. And one last mechanism is reputation, right? So that's why we see this online rating system are there. And also the companies, they care about their brand image, right? So that's the effect of reputation, right? Because of reputation, they are more likely to cooperate, to gain this reputation, right? So both repeated interaction and reputation depend on continued interaction. Right? So either is you are interacting with the same person or interacting with someone else, but your past behavior is known by the other person. So this repeated interaction is the key for both mechanisms. So this explains why companies spend a big chunk of money advertising, because this big chunk of money would only pay off if the company and the product can last for a long period of time, right? So this is a signal from this corresponding company, right? So the willingness to spend huge amount of money advertising in itself can convince the consumers that this company care about its image. Because they have spent huge amount of money, it's actually not rational for them. It's hurt their profit if they actually cheat on the quality of the product, right? So this is repeated interaction and reputation in fact, right? So because of this reputation and repeated interaction in fact, this content of advertising is actually not important as long as it's expensive, right? So because it's just a signal. And also one interesting phenomena that I observe is that when you are in a small town where there are not a lot of people, people are usually nicer to each other compared to a big city. If you go to New York, go to Copenhagen, for example, they are very populated people, they don't stop say hi because they seem to be busy. Why is that the case? It can also be explained by this repeated interaction and prisoner dilemma. When you have this long-term relationship, then when you have in a small town, you are more likely to meet the same person in the near future, right? So that's why you'll be nicer to each other. And also in a small town, what you do will be known by other people. So reputation also play an important role, right? So both repeated interaction, or this so-called direct reciprocity, and reputation, which is indirect reciprocity, worked on this condition of repeated interaction, right? So that's the three mechanisms that you can solve prisoner dilemma that help to establish cooperation, right? So one common criticism of lab experiment or in-class experiment that we observed is the low stakes. They are not able to reflect behavior in everyday life, right? So this is some criticism that you will receive from people criticizing behavior economics, right? Is this a valid criticism? Well, partially, because indeed some of the situations that involve cooperation, they have much higher stake compared to several Danish corners, right, in the lab or in the in-class experiment. But we do see some of the cooperation situation have low stake. But again, it is also valid to ask whether this cooperation, right, situation can be more consistent with Nash equilibrium prediction when the stakes are high, when people are tempted to defect. So that means when the stakes are high, are people more likely to defect, to be more consistent with the Nash equilibrium prediction? Well, it's difficult to pay a huge amount of money in lab experiment or in online experiment and in-class experiment. But we do have real-life situations like the game show, right? So here is actually one famous game show called Golden Balls that was broadcast in UK. So there are different stages of the game, but the last stage of this game is just a prisoner dilemma, right? So here, the golden ball features stakes very high, ranging from 100 pounds, British pounds, to over 100,000 British pounds. Right? So basically, at the last stage of this game show, two finalists have to make a decision to divide a prize, whether to steal or split. Right? So here, let's assume that these two contestants decided to split or divide this 100,000 pounds. Right? So if both of them decide to split, then they split this prize. If one decide to steal and the other decide to split, then the one who steal get all the money, the other get nothing. Right? But if both of them decided to steal, then none of them get anything. Right? So this is definitely a prisoner dilemma. Right? So I do not have time to watch these videos together in class. You can just click these two video clips that illustrate very interesting phenomena, right? So how people communicate with each other to establish trust, but betrayal can never be avoided. And then we have here this guy, I think his name is Nick, actually used a very interesting strategy to trick the others to cooperate with him. I mean, we can tell that this guy called Abraham actually planned to defect, to steal, but using a very interesting strategy, Nick actually tricked the other guy to split, and eventually they split the prize. Right? So very interesting video clip, but you can actually watch this on your own. Right? So now the question that we posed before, are people more likely to be selfish and rational, as predicted by Nash equilibrium, as the stakes go up? Well, here are the statistics showing the average cooperation rate from all the games played on this TV show Golden Ball. Right? As we can see here, I mean, on the x-axis is representing the corresponding stake size from 100 British pounds to 100,000 British pounds. Right? The cooperation rate is represented by the bars, and this dashed line represents the average cooperation rate. And this solid line with a square on it is actually a fitted model of the predicted cooperation rate, right? So using a model. I mean, for this class, it's not important to understand what they mean. You can just actually look at this general tendency, right? So basically, when the stakes are small, 100 pound, for example, the cooperation rate is actually quite high. It's close to 70 to 80%. But as we increase the stakes, we do observe this decrease in cooperation rate, but it never goes to zero. Right? So even with 100,000 pounds, cooperation rate is close to 50%. Half of them actually decided to split, to cooperate. Right? So here the average is about 45%, for example. So on average, cooperation rate is about 50%. Right? So this addresses our concern. Even with high stakes, people are still willing to cooperate with each other, right? And you may be wondering why the cooperation rate is surprisingly high when the stakes are lower, right? I mean, for one thing, is this is a TV show, you still care about your image, right? So whether you did still cooperation is a social norm. I mean, if you cooperate with others, I mean, you'll be considered as a good man, for example. Right? And another thing is that if you are on a TV show, the stakes, the average stakes are several thousands British pounds, right? So 100 British pounds seems very small amount of money. So in that case, you probably would not risk this defection to ruin people's image towards you, right? So because comparing 100,000 British pounds, 100 British pounds is a small amount of money, right? So that's why you see this cooperation rate is actually much higher compared to the lab level, right? So, I mean, to summarize, on average, cooperation rate are about the same as observed in the lab. So here it is a social norm to cooperate. And when stakes are high, the cost of abiding by the norm is high because you are giving up, like here, 50 for the large highest stake, you are giving up 50,000 British pounds to abide by the norm, right? So the cost of abiding by the norm is high, so that's why people are more likely, slightly more likely to defect, right? Because the temptation is much higher. But in general, we do observe a really high, significant cooperation rate. So some observations towards this behavior on the game show, we observe that people lies. If you look at their communication before they decide on their decision, right? So like they will say that I'm not the sort of person who would steal, and I hope you are not one of those evil types either, right? So this is actually one statement coming from the one who actually stole from this prize. And we also observe that people making an explicit promise to cooperate are 30% more likely to do so. Right? So this explicit promise, I mean, it's a good signal. 30%, of course, is not foolproof sign, but it's actually a good signal, a good predictor, because people are more willing to lie by omission than commission, right? So when they are decided to steal, I mean, they would just use different ways of framing so that I'm not the sort of person who would steal, right? They will not make the promise that I will not steal in this game. Right? So this specific promise is a good signal that the other person, the contestant will not defect, right? And another observation is that here is the propensity to cooperate across ages and genders. And we see some differences, but the most significant observation in this graph is that young men, the males who are below 30, they are significantly less likely to cooperate, more likely to defect, right? So maybe the mindset of competition is quite strong, right? So this is just one interesting observation. Another show that demonstrates cooperation is, the YouTuber, famous YouTuber, Mr. Beast, right? So he just spent a huge amount of money to invite people to this reality show to go through all kinds of challenges, right? So here is one interesting experiment or interesting show that one former policeman and former prisoner, they actually put together into the prison, and they go through 100 days. After, if they persist, they are successful in staying in the prison for 100 days, they will win 500,000 US dollars, right? And the last stage of this game, of this show, is actually they were put in separate cells, right? And then they decide whether to get out of the cell ahead of this last 24 hours. So during the last day, 24 hours, they can decide whether they stay in the cell. If both of them decide to stay in the cell, then at the end, they split the prize, the award, right? Here is not, you see that here is not 500,000 in total because they spend some money across these 100 days, right? But at any time during the 24 hours, if you decided to get out of the cell by push a button, then you will get all the money, right? And the one who actually pushed the button to get out first would get all the money, right? So this is very similar to Brewster's dilemma. And what do you think whether they are able to cooperate to share this price with each other? That's the suspense, right? And you can click this link that you can find on the lecture notes and watch the end. Right? So this is a very nice illustration of Brewster's dilemma. All right, so that is our discussion of cooperation. And next, we'll spend maybe 20 minutes or so to finish our discussion of coordination. Coordination games are quite different from the game of cooperation. Cooperation game, the Brewster's dilemma has the dominant strategy. So there is only Nash equilibrium to defect, right? Even though it's mutually beneficial to cooperate. Well, in coordination game, there are multiple equilibria, right? So that means dominant strategies do not exist because the best action would depend on what the opponent, what the other player will do, right? So because there are multiple Nash equilibria, the problem of equilibrium selection arises, right? Because which equilibrium of the two, if we have a 2x2 game, will be selected? So that's the question to ask. So if you think about the previous examples, when we discussed strategic interdependence beauty contest to choose the most beautiful face, and you get paid if your choice is the same as another randomly chosen player's choice, right? And the meeting place are both coordination game, right? So in these games, as we discussed, focal points help equilibrium selection. So let's go through some examples of coordination to illustrate sometimes why it is actually difficult to coordinate on a specific outcome, so specific equilibrium. So we introduced this example of QWERTY keyboard, right? So we mentioned that QWERTY keyboard is actually not an efficient keyboard. And another keyboard layout called Dvorak is proven to be more efficient. People can use that keyboard to type at a faster speed. But even though it's efficient, we seldom see anyone using this Dvorak design, right? Because most people have never heard of it. Why is this the case? I mean, this is similar to the choice of technology, sure, that illustrate this phenomena called path dependence, right? So to understand this situation, we can again model this situation as a game. Consider the example as two types of keyboard, right? So each individual consumers can decide whether they choose QWERTY or use Dvorak. So here is the payoff matrix for this game. If both of the players or consumers choose QWERTY, then they receive 8. If both of them choose Dvorak, they choose 10. Right? So this is the so-called network effect or network externality. The reason that you want to use a keyboard is because most of other people are using the keyboard, right? So that's why, I mean, if you always use your own keyboard, it's not an issue. But sometimes, for example, you go to the airport, you want to type something. I mean, if you are familiar with one keyboard, but in the airport is another keyboard, I mean, it's a hassle. If you borrow computers from some other people, I mean, then it's also very inconvenient for you, right? Also, when a lot of people are using the same keyboard because of the economy of scale, I mean, it's actually cheaper to produce, and the purchasing price is also lower, right? So that's why we see here people would like to use the same type of keyboard as other people, which here to simplify the situation is a 2x2 game. You are just playing another player, right? But of course, the real situation is that you are playing with a multitude of other consumers. If you miscoordinate, meaning that you are using different type of keyboard, then these two players would receive the 0 payoff. Right? As you can see here, it is more efficient to illustrate this concept. It is more efficient to use for both players to use the Dvorak keyboard. Right? But if you have the strong belief that the other person will use QWERTY, then you are actually more likely to use QWERTY. right? And this is a phenomena called path dependence. Past conventions and experience can act as a focal point, leading to inefficient outcome, right? So this nicely illustrates this interesting phenomena called path dependence, right? So uh, if you look at the railway track, the width of the railway track, right? So this is another example. The reason, I mean, it's not the most efficient width, and the reason that we are using it because the first designer in the UK actually used this width, and then most other countries, most other builders actually follow this width, right? So that is again the path dependence, right? And also the measurement unit. Uh, in the United States, it has this so-called imperial or customary uh, system. That's why when you read some American textbooks, the units are not in meters, right? So they are in miles, in foot, and the corresponding volume is measured by gallon, and the weight is measured by ounce. I mean, it's actually not an efficient measurement units, right? But in the States, it's because of past dependency. It has been there. It's very difficult and actually costly for it to change, right? So that's why we have different measurement unit, right? So look at this AC power plugs, right? So if you travel internationally, you probably will notice that you likely need to have this plug converter so that you are able to plug your laptop uh, to the socket locally, right? So why is that the case? It's again because of path dependence. So one interesting case is in China, right? So China actually have this very inefficient design of power plug, right? It's actually a combination of the um, so-called European system with the two round holes and the US system, which is just two straight lines, and also the Australian system. But because it has been produced that way for many years, it's very difficult to change, right? So that's the idea of path dependence. Now, talking about the selection of multiple equilibrium in the lab, is if you look at the payoff matrix, it's actually not difficult to choose the most efficient one because without past history or past experience, it's easier for participant in the experiment to choose the most efficient equilibrium, right? So we see that when you are playing this game, almost all of the participants are able to coordinate on the most efficient one. I mean, the issue here is that when you have past experience, that could prescribe what you are likely to choose and get you trapped into the inefficient equilibrium. Right? So that is the first example, the path dependence. Right? Now the second example is called the stack hunt game. Right? So the original description of the stack hunt game was mentioned by Jean Rousseau, the French philosopher. I mean, he conceived this situation that two hunters, right, they can go out to hunt something, right? So they can either hunt a stag, stag is just a name for a male deer, or a hare. Right? A hare gives 10 units of meat. A stag gives rise to 30 units of meat. Right? But the issue here is that each hunter can hunt a hare on its own. You can just go and get a hare, but hunting a stag requires the collaboration of the two hunters, and they can split the meat. Right? So here is the depiction of this situation, right? So two-player game, each hunter can decide whether to hunt a stag or to hunt a hare. If you look at the payoff, you may be tempted to think that, of course, it's best for both hunters to choose stag because they can split the 30 units of meat. Right? So the payoff is significantly higher than if you just hunt individually for a hare. But the issue here is that whether you can trust the other person to go and hunt the stag with you without previous communication. Right? So if you look at this payoff matrix, I mean, I actually taught this game for a former MBA student. I mean, one student actually mentioned, why would someone on earth would ever choose hair? Because it's definitely more efficient to choose stack. But the issue is that it's actually risky to choose a stack, right? So look at the payoff matrix. Of course, if you're sure the other person will choose stack, you will definitely go for stack because that would give you a higher payoff, right? It's 10 over 50. But if you're unsure, what is your choice? If you choose hair, you can get 10 guaranteed. But if you choose stack, and if the other person will choose hair, then you will get 0, right? So, I mean, here is why this game is also called assurance game. Whether you can get assured that the other person would choose this more risky option to choose to go for a stack, right? So even if you believe that the other person is likely to choose stack, whether you can believe that the other person will trust you to choose stack, right? Because if they don't trust you, they will probably would go for this safe option. I mean, that's why it's actually not straightforward to see stack is chosen by both hunters, right? So which strategy will you choose in this case? It's difficult to say. So talking about the background of stack hunt, we do see real life examples like this Lama Lara whale hunters of Indonesia. They play stack hunt game all the time. So usually they have a team to coordinate with each other, right? So we have a captain, they have a captain, a navigator, a spotter, and daring men, and also the daring men. With this pole to get the corresponding whale, and then they should be willing to stand on the prow and throw a harpoon, right? So they have to trust each other to play this stack hunt game. Right? So let's look at and let's analyze this game, right? So here we have a 2x2 game. I mean, there are two Nash equilibrium. If the other person chooses stack, then the best response is to choose also stack. If the other person chooses hair, then it's best for you to also choose hair, right? So both of these two outcomes are Nash equilibrium. But here, hunting a hair will give you a certain payoff without any risk. And jointly hunting a stack gives the higher payoff, but it's risky, right? So that means there is the so-called strategic uncertainty. Can you trust the other person to play stack? Even if you trust her, will she trust you? Right. So here we call the stack equilibrium a payoff dominant equilibrium because it provides a higher payoff. But on the other hand, hair equilibrium is the risk dominant equilibrium because it minimizes the risk. It guarantees some payoff for sure. Right. So even though stack is payoff dominant, provide a higher payoff, playing a hair is less risky, give you some guaranteed payoff. Right? So it's actually not obvious that people would coordinate on stack. We'll see in the next slide on the result on your actual play. Right? So here is just a 2x2 game. Sometimes we have a situation where multiple players actually play this stack hunt game. Coordination in a multiple player games would become more difficult because as the number of players increase, I mean, it's become significantly more difficult to coordinate. Okay? So let's look at the experimental result, right? So here is the stack hunt game, one version you played. You'll see that even though it is obvious, it's obviously best for both players to choose stack. I mean, initially, half of you choose stack, but gradually it dragged to the hair, the more safe option, right? But let's look at another game, right? So the difference here is that the gains to choose hair will be greater in the second game, right? So in the past, you can increase your payout by 50%. Now you increase your payout by almost 100%. It's 90% to 100%, right? So in this case, we see stack is more attractive. Now let's look at the result. You see a small change in the payoff structure would actually significantly increase the average level of choosing stack. All right. So here you can try to understand the risk of playing stack by calculating the expected payoffs, right? Suppose another person, would choose stack for 50% of the time. Then the expected payoff of choosing stack is 7.5, right? And here, so 7.5 compared to 8, it's slightly lower. But if you have a higher belief that the other person will choose stack, stack will be more attractive. Here, if you look at the expected payoff, 50% of the other person choosing stack, then the expected payoff is again 8.5, I think. Yeah, I think here I said it with the wrong number. Yeah, it should be 8.5. So the expected payoff is higher. And here, the expected payoff 8.5 is lower than 10. It's actually expected payoff, assuming the other person choosing both actions with equal probability is lower than playing here. Right? So that's one way to understand the risk, how risky it is to choose stack. Right? So these stack on game can help us understand the example we mentioned before, this 3DO interactive multiplayer, right? So they have the most advanced technology, and they try to license their technology to the software companies and hardware companies, but they fail. Why is this the case? We can understand this as a coordination game between the hardware company and software company, right? So both companies can choose to produce the corresponding products consistent with this advanced technology or not to produce, right? So this can be just considered as a stack on game, right? So one issue here is that the consumers would not buy software if they don't own hardware. And hardware needs to be sold at affordable price to generate a market, right? And also consumers will not buy hardware unless there is enough software, right? So just like, at the start, iPhone was popular compared to like Siemens, like produced by Nokia, because it's not only produced the corresponding hardware, but also with the corresponding apps that you can use, right? Without the apps, this hardware is just useless, right? So here is the coordination issue. Because consumers would only buy the hardware if they are accompanying software. They are willing to buy the software if there would be the good option of hardware, right? So in this case, the coordination between hardware company and the software company make it a stack on game, make it difficult for this good outcome to be achieved, right? So that's why you see that most of the game console companies, they not only produce the hardware, but also the software at the same time, right? When the market is established, then you can attract more software developers to come and develop games for you, right? So 3DO relies too much on the other player who did not share the 3DO incentives. And 3DO took some remedial moves, but other companies, the Japanese company Sega and Sony, had captured almost all the market share in the 32-bit video games, and Nintendo released the 34-bit machines at a lower price. So that's why we see the failure of 3DO multiplayer companies. So the last type of coordination games are those where two players have opposing interests. So in many situations that requires coordinated action, people exhibit opposing interests. Like in the family, husband and wife decide who would go to do these household chores. In a company, right? So in a team member would have different interests. Someone would like to start project A, the other would like to have the project B, but they need to decide to have some agreement. Or different department, different teams within the same company would have this opposing interest, right? So these situations can be summarized as two types of games. One game is called Game of Chicken. The other is called the Battle of the Sexes, right? So here are some examples, right? Two examples, one for each of these two games. So let's just have a look at this game of chicken. This game, first was describing these two drivers headed for a single lane bridge from opposite directions. And the first to swerve away would yield the bridge to the other. Right? And the goal also, if both of the drivers go straight, would cause deadlock or collision. Right? So to summarize this game, it can be illustrated as a payoff matrix like this. Right? So here, the best, because it's a coordination game, the best action would depends on the other player's action, right? So if the other person choose to swerve, it's best for you to go straight, right? If the other goes straight, then it's best for you to swerve. So just choose different actions. That's why it's called also called anti-coordination game, right? So game of chicken is also known as hawk-dove game in biology because here to swerve, meaning that you're playing a soft strategy, you try to yield to the other, you try to play nice, right? And hawk, meaning that you are aggressive, right? And what is the likely outcome in this game? I mean, here again we have two Nash equilibrium, right? Try to choose a different action compared to the other player. This game of chicken can also help us to understand or can be used to model market entry. Right? So for example, two firms are contemplating entry, but the market is only large enough to support one company in this whole industry. In this case, the two firms can stay out or can choose to enter this market. And the best action, whether to enter or stay out, depends on the other firm's choice. Right? So if the other firm choose to enter, then you stay out. If the other firm choose to stay out, it's best for you to enter so that you are able to earn the highest profit. Right? So experimental result. If we look at how you played in this game, you see around 50% of you choose soft, right? And of course, whether you want to choose soft or tough will depends on the situation. If you believe most other people are soft, then it's best for you to play tough. If you believe most other people are tough, then it's best for you to play soft, right? So that's why it's also called hawk-dove strategy in evolutionary biology, right? So in the population of animals, whether you are aggressive or have this good temper, I mean, depends on the composition of the population, right? So if most people are aggressive, then people who are of good temper, they will have some evolutionary advantage. So their strategy will be adopted by more animals, right? So eventually there will be some balance so that the expected payoff of being aggressive or being mild will be more or less the same. I mean, it's also in the case of our lab experiment. So if we allow this game to play for a long period of time, it's possible that in the long run, the expected payoff of playing soft and tough will be similar. So the game of chicken can also be used to model volunteers dilemma. In this case, for example, two roommates, they need to have a volunteer to throw out the trash, but we only need one person. In this case, who would volunteer? I mean, that's the problem, right? So you want to coordinate so that the trash is taken out, but you would prefer the other person to do the thing, right? So for one-shot game, coordination is not that easy, but if you allow this game to play repeatedly, I mean, the most likely outcome is turn taking, as we discuss. It's also the same for the battle of sexes, right? So when you allow this coordination game to play for a long period of time, have this repeated interaction, turn taking is one likely outcome. The battle of sexes is another type of anti-coordination game. So the situation is like this: a man and a woman hope to meet. There are two events to attend: boxing or ballet. The man prefer boxing, the woman prefer ballet. Both of them would prefer to go to the same event so that they can enjoy the evening together, but they have opposing interests, right? They have mild preferences to which event to go to. So here is an illustration, right? So if they go to boxing together, I mean, the man would have a higher payoff than the woman. If they go to ballet together, the woman would have a higher payoff compared to the man. If they go to different event, then none of them receive any payoff, right? So that's the worst outcome. So without communication, where should they go? It's difficult. It's very difficult to coordinate in this case, as illustrated by our experiment, right? The miscoordination rate is close to 50%, right? So here I relabel this game again as the action of choosing tough or choosing soft, right? Without communication, one-shot play often leads to miscoordination, right? But for anti-coordination game, if you allow repeated interactions, turn taking is often emerge, right? Also in the game of chicken or the volunteer's dilemma. Okay. So to solve this coordination problem, credible commitment can shift the expectations and help coordination. Right? So for all kinds of coordination game, commitment is one way to help the coordination issue. For example, play the game of chicken, right? So two drivers driving towards each other. I mean, if one driver can just throw away the steering wheel that you cannot swerve, I mean, that may convince the other guys that you will definitely go straight, so the other guy would chicken out, right? So for market entry game, if you have limited pricing, I mean, that's one way to make this commitment. And if you have the sunk capacity, you build this capacity to try to scare out potential entries. So that's a part of commitment, right? So exclusive contract, pre-announced launch dates, those are all commitment devices that can help you, help the players to achieve coordination. And also pre-play communication, if you are allowed to communicate with each other, I mean, that would definitely help. And the previous experience like reputation, incumbency as focal points, or a tiebreaker like a coin flip regulator can also help coordination, right? So that is the way to solve coordination issue, okay?